Yesterday we looked at the background of Ezekiel and this time of turmoil, time of corruption and sin on the part of the nation that had grown continually through the years. And we saw the international political turmoil that was there, and in the midst of this, God raises up really three prophets. Jeremiah, who is in the land of Canaan, Daniel with the leadership in Babylon, and Ezekiel with the people on the river Kibar at the site of Tel Aviv. You know, those three ministries, as we mentioned, were different. And gentlemen, recognize that God seeks to glorify himself through you in different ways. And he can do that. There's not just one way. Just don't be looking to be like somebody else, but God be what he wants to be and do what he wants to do in your life. And it's exciting to see that and to enjoy that and to see his mighty working. We saw the call of Ezekiel yesterday. What are some of the principles that we learn from the call of Ezekiel?
The responsibility to preach the message whether people listen or not.
Okay, tremendous truth. Our message is not determined by the response of people. We preach God's word, yes.
God uniquely prepared him for that specific ministry.
Right. God prepared him, and he will prepare you uniquely for your ministry. That's good.
It just wasn't all about him having fun in the ministry. There was real challenges with it.
Okay. Ministry can be a real challenge, far more than we sometimes recognize. And yet we don't give up. Yes?
It began with a vision of God's glory and ended with that, and it was meant to sustain him.
Right. The significance, so important, of the fact of our seeing God, knowing God, having that relationship, the impact of the character of God, and that's what sustains us, yes.
God did certain things to enable him, to empower him during that time.
All right. He did things that enabled and empowered him specifically through the Spirit of God, that he worked through him, yes.
Just because they are rebellious, we need to be guarded that we don't become rebellious.
Great. That's one we can overlook real quick. But it's such a great temptation that you finally get fed up. I don't know if you've been at that place yet in your ministry, where you're just kind of like, I've had it. And I'd say probably one of the biggest, unfortunately, examples of that in the scripture is Moses, where he finally got fed up with the people. Consequences of that were great. Yes.
The utter faithfulness of God to his covenant.
Amen. God is so faithful to his covenant. What he has said, what he said he will do in his agreement and his treaty with his people. The faithfulness of God.
God initiated the call.
Okay? It's initiated by God. Ezekiel didn't go out and say, this is what I want to do. Probably nobody would go out and say, that's what I want to do. But in his particular situation. But that's very important. It was initiation of God. And God, by the way, has no problems doing that. Remember, God is not limited in communication. He can always communicate. He has no problems doing that. Okay? Any other things? Yes?
Internalizing the word, Ezekiel had to eat the scroll.
Okay, the importance to get the Word of God on the inside. Beautiful passage of that is the Shema. I don't know if, in Deuteronomy 6. Talk about you love the Lord your God, and then he tells you how. First of all, you put it on the heart before you communicate it to your first family, by the way. Another important truth in that passage. But the importance of internalizing the Word of God. That it's part of us. I don't know about you, but I think the older you get, when you hear somebody preach and teach, you'll know pretty quickly, is it really theirs or are they borrowing it from somebody? There's just somewhat of a hollowness of somebody preaching something they've never experienced or done. And it kind of comes through. I don't know about you. I can sit there and say, there's something not right here. And yeah, that often can happen. It must become part of us. We must apply it. And men, the application of the Word of God, we need models in our world today of that. Great. Any other? Yes?
Israel was to be a watchman over the house of Israel, just as we are to be over those who...
Okay, Ezekiel was a watchman. And what does the watchman do? He warns the people of the problems and the issues that are coming against them, the dangers, both without and within. Here, with Ezekiel, is predominantly without, though he challenges about the issues of inside also, by analogy of the city. And we have a role in ministry, among others, not solely that, but among others, to be those who are alert to the dangers around us. Not that we're out there trying to look under every tree to see if we can create some dangers, but we're alert to them, and we speak to them and warn and prepare our people to be able to, in a sense, defend themselves and to deal with those issues that are before them. Good. Yes.
The priesthood ministry of the people then and now.
Okay, in the general sense of the background, they had a priestly ministry. Of course, Ezekiel is a Levitical priest, but everyone has a priestly ministry. And they were to be those who represented God to the world and bring the world to God. And as a people, they failed. Are we failing today? Are we really? I drive down the freeway this morning, and boy, there's a lot of people coming and going. It doesn't make a difference which way you want to go. It's full. Same's true in Moscow. It's a parking lot at this time of the day. There's people out there, millions of people. Are we reaching them? Are we thinking that way? Or are we just thinking us? Okay, good. All right, as the book moves on, we looked at chapters 4 to 7. What is chapter 4 telling us? What happens in chapter 4? Nothing? Well, I really did a good job yesterday. Yes, Freddie?
When he lays on his side and dramatically represents the sea.
Okay. Chapter 4 essentially is a monodrama of Ezekiel laying siege to the city of Jerusalem. He sketched that out there on that brick, the city. He sets up the siege engines and all the equipment, siege wall, lays there and lays siege to the city. Laying on the left side for 390 days to bear the punishment of Israel. 40 days on his right side facing south for Judah. And showing that the diet would be very meager and the things that they would eat in the what we now call the Ezekiel 4:9 type of food. It was... you got the best part of it with the bread. And I didn't tell you yesterday that we actually cooked that over human dung, but it just, no breaks at this time to go. And of course, though we didn't touch upon that specifically, again, a picture of the defilement even of the food that they would have to eat when they would go into foreign lands. Very graphically, simply portraying this is what's going to happen. This is the judgment that's coming. And the people were watching this show, so to speak, watching each act as it comes by. In the presentation. And So as he lays this siege to the city, and he eats a meager and later would become a defiled diet, as they would have the meager diet within the siege, and as they leave and be in foreign countries would deal with the issue of the defilement. What happens in chapter 5? Is he still there laying on his side, laying siege to the city? Mm-hmm. Okay.
Three are thirds, and one is scattered to the wind, one is caught by a sword, and one is shortly pestilence.
All right. We have a little barber shop going on here, personally inflicted. He cut his hair and shaved his beard and became a Yule Brunner, I guess, or something like that. I mean, if you remember who he is, that dates me, I guess. Yeah, although there's a lot of other people like that today, some by choice and some by natural coming. This was a disgrace in the priesthood. And so he is picturing, in a sense, of the disgrace and the humiliation of the people by this act that he's doing. And he's also showing what will happen to the people. A third of them will die in the city by fire. A third will be killed by the sword, mostly those as they come out of the city, though even some in. And then there will be a third scattered to the wind, and out of that third there will be a little small group. He sticks in the hem of his garment to protect them. That's the remnant, those that do believe. There's always the righteous ones who are there. So he's actually going on in this, we might say the scene 2, of showing this dispersion and showing what's going to happen to the people by the cutting of the hair and these things. Then as the drama's still going on there, and remember he's mute in all of this, what happens when we come to chapter 6?
The end. The end is coming.
The end. Yeah, the end basically comes in chapter 7, more stressed in chapter 7. In chapter 6, he goes on in an oral message, and only when God would raise him up to do that would he speak at this time, but before he comes to the collapse of Jerusalem. But he's telling them that what's going to happen in the land, all of this idolatry, all of this pagan worship, God's going to remove it. It's going to be destroyed. You think it's wonderful? You think this is the way to go? Yet. Oh, well, I mean, no, pardon me. I'm sorry. It gets confusing when you know too many languages. I speak to my Russian tutor and I come out with a Hebrew word or a German word, and she looks at me with a strange thing, and I always tell her, it's the right word, it's the wrong language. But here he is in this situation, and God's saying, this is going to be removed. I don't like this stuff. You might like it, but I'm going to clean house. I'm going to take it all away. And I hope we begin to perceive God's heart. God is a holy God. And I don't know about you, sometimes I have a hard time getting a hand on that. I know it's true, but experientially, it's so easy just to float along and ignore the profane that's occurring in my life. I don't know about you. I find that. And suddenly, God, you're reading the text and God brings it to your mind that, doop, and you go, oh, no. Yeah. And we should be so thankful for the Spirit that does that, convicts us as we go along. But I hope we grow in our understanding of holiness and how important it is to God. And holiness and these things are not because God's just standing around looking for things, let's see, which one of these guys is going to be unholy first. Gotcha. And he's trying to pass judgments and disciplines. He wants us for our sake, for our well-being as well as for His glory, to be holy, because it's the best way to live. And Israel just never quite got that, and it's hard for us at times, you know. Well, but you know, what will people think? And we don't do things that way, and so forth. Okay, and then in 7, as we've already mentioned, the end, the imminency, the comprehensiveness, the 4 corners of the land. It's going to cover everything. And it's now, it's the end, it's coming soon, right here. And yet in the midst of all this, what do we have as an offer? Is there any way out? Yeah. Invitation to turn, to seek God. In fact, we saw that as we closed in chapter 7. He says to them, I will deal with them according to their conduct, and by their own standards I will judge them. Then they will know that I am Yahweh. He has told them to seek Him, to turn to Him. He wants them to know Him. Man, this again, let me simply say, Yada is not just academic. You don't academically know your wife, I hope. And that's the term that's used in relationship between husband and wife. Yes, there is factual knowledge. And yes, there is intimate experiential knowledge. And they go together. You know, Hebrew doesn't have all the finer nuances in all of its words. It often packs more into one. But God wants us to know Him intimately in our relationship. He created us to have a relationship with Him. We're not studying Genesis, but we go back there and could have a great time. He created us. Why? He rushed so quickly to talk about man and then the relationship of man and woman in Genesis. And He created them to be an image of Him. Well, part of which is relational beings, as the Godhead is relational. We could spend time on that. It's wonderful passages. But that's what God wants. That's why you're here, is to be a relation with God and then be His priest. Really not too difficult, is it? It's a pretty simple lifestyle. You know, if we just complicate it as best we can in the process. Now, this brings us to chapter 8. Chapter 8, we begin with a statement, in the 6th year, in the 6th month, on the 5th day. God loved the 5th day, didn't He? We're talking about approximately 13 months after the messages that were dated in chapters 1 to 7. I think of that because He says, I was sitting in my house, and the elders of Judah were sitting before me, and the hand of the Lord came upon me, and I looked and I saw that figure of a man, and in verse 3, He stretched out what looked like a hand and took me by the hair of my head and lifted me up. Well, certainly been long enough to let his hair grow out. You know, the barbers always say the difference between a good haircut and a bad one is about 6 weeks. And he had enough hair, and He lifted him up. Now, he's actually finishing up his right side. Okay, if you take all the days, he's still there, drama. He's finishing up the right side, so everybody's out here still probably getting bored by now. Yeah, this is kind of boring. All this guy does is lay around in his ministry. And he just plays games here, and you know, people play computer games today, but he plays siege games on the ground. And when is he going to do something new? You know, he did this hair thing, you know, a little while ago, and okay, of course, some may have said we got it. It doesn't appear like any of them really got it, but okay, you've done that, and now suddenly, where'd this guy go? Almost. It's in a vision, however, that we read here, that they're watching. And notice he's in his house. Again, I think this bears out the fact that they're not bound and have to be right down on the ground against the siege every moment, 24/7, as we use the phrase today. He was sitting in his house, and he's mute, and the elders are sitting before him. They don't want to let this guy out of their sight. This guy, we don't believe what he says, but we want to know what he does, kind of a thing. You'll find people like that in your ministry. They'll argue and they don't like what you say and so forth, but they're always there. They want to hear. That's good. Let them hear. Okay? And so he's sitting there with them, and the elders sitting before him, and the hand of the Lord comes upon him, which again, remember, is to strengthen him. And I looked and I saw a figure like that of a man, from what appeared to be his waist down like fire, and from there upward the appearance as bright as glowing metal. Exactly the same description we had in chapter 1 of the figure sitting on the throne. If you go look, and the difference of what comes from waist down, what's up, and the description there, it's the same description that we have here. And he stretched out what looked like a hand, and took me by the head of my hair, and the Spirit lifted me up between the earth and heavens, in a vision of God, and took me to Jerusalem. Now, he is taken to Jerusalem in the vision. Okay, that's important. He doesn't go on a journey, around the Fertile Crescent, down to Jerusalem. It'd take him about 3 months. He's lifted up. So what we will now see in chapters 8, 9, 10, 11 is what he saw in the vision. And in his vision, he was transported to Jerusalem. So now he's standing, as we will see, in the temple court. And he's going to tell us what he sees here. He's been taken right to the religious center of the people of Judah and those remaining in the country. We're going to see here that the primary thrust of this vision is to show the cause of the judgment. Okay? If there's any question why what I've just illustrated is going to happen, you were saying, well, but why? Well, the way the text will come, after he does the vision, he comes back and tells the people all that he saw. So we know they're going to hear this. But right now he's in the vision. But what it's going to do, it's going to help them see how corrupt and wicked and full of degradation and pollution that the people of Judah and Jerusalem, the way they are. Mm-hmm.
So can I ask, if he's brought in a vision to Jerusalem, is what he is seeing actually happening in Jerusalem, or is God giving him a vision where God concentrates all the evil that represents Jerusalem in that vision? So is what he's seeing real?
Well, that's a good question. I've never been in a vision before, so we have to understand it's in a vision, and I think everything is spelled out quite clearly as far as the layout of the temple. So it would appear to me that he's revealing to him this, he's not in Jerusalem. I come back. This is what you would see if you were there. I'm transporting you. This is what you'd see in the temple. This is the type of things that are going on there. I don't see any basis for this being some kind of imaginary type thing. He's wanting him to know exactly what is the perversion and the corruption that's taking place in Jerusalem. And we're going to see here, whenever we see the corruption, we'll see the clear contrast between the glory of God, in which we must include His holiness, and the profane corruption and sin of the people. It's not a gray, it's a black and white type of contrast. A tremendous contrast between God's glory and the extreme moral and spiritual corruption of the nation. And in this case, and here we're going to really hit a key issue of Ezekiel, especially the corruption of the leaders. Leadership is so strategic, as I mentioned yesterday. Throughout the history of Israel, as the king went, so went the people. That's an awesome thought when you consider being in a place of leadership among God's people. Yes?
Are we still pre-siege at this point? I know you mentioned the timeline here. Where are we at between the deportations as far as the timing of this particular vision?
This vision is in 592. We're not at the beginning of the siege yet. We're pre-siege. Yeah. Thank you. So, if you can transport yourself, I realize, I hope you don't have a vision at this moment, but if you could transport, please stay with me. Transport yourself as if you now are standing in the temple complex. How many of you ever been to Israel? Good number. And have you seen the model that's there of Jerusalem in New Testament times? Well, that gives you a kind of a good pictorial framework. He's standing there, and he's going to see what happens predominantly with the corruption of the leaders. And those leaders are the ones that basically are the cause of leading the people astray to bring the judgment of God. And that's going to be clear. And their abominable, idolatrous practices are clear. First thing he sees when he arrives there, not people, he sees to the north, at the entrance between the outer court and the inner court, at the north gate, outside, what is called the image of jealousy. Now, we're not told a lot in the text about the image of jealousy. It's out there. There's an image of jealousy in the outer court, an idol of jealousy, which we're told provokes Yahweh to jealousy and to anger, because He alone is God. Okay? Now, there's discussion as to what is the image of jealousy. And of course, this is, in interpretation, this is usually always where we kind of stop and camp. What's that? And I got to know exactly what that is. Well, I wish we could know everything exactly. It's an image of jealousy out there, and there are those that say, well, this is the image, the statue of Asherah. Now, Asherah, remember, is the mother goddess of the Canaanite pantheon that was established by Manasseh under his reign near the north gate there in the outer temple. And so there will be many that will argue that point. Only problem is that we read in the text in 2 Kings 23 that at the later time of Manasseh, he removed that statue there and he burned it. Somebody's going to have to resurrect it to get it here at this time in 592. So most likely it's not the statue of Manasseh, the statue of Asherah. Others put forth that this Jeremiah refers in Jeremiah 7 and in chapter 44 refers to a statue of the Queen of Heaven. And he denounces that. He doesn't help us know a whole lot more about what that is. Maybe this is the Queen of Heaven. Some argue that, well, because the identity is assumed because there's no description, just simply saying it is an idol, a statue of jealousy, but it doesn't identify it, that the people should have known, that Ezekiel should have known what it was. And I'm glad he might have known that, because I don't. We just have to say it could be the Queen of Heaven that's mentioned by Jeremiah. It does not appear that it should be the statue of Asherah. We don't know exactly. One thing we know it's detestable. It is that which provokes God's jealousy because it must be seeking to be an idol that wants to be God among the people. Here it is, erected right in the temple court. But then we quickly move, and he says, now I'm going to show you more detestable things. And actually, the more detestable things are going to be actually what the people are doing, the leaders. Not just some idol figures, we're going to have plenty of those. But what are they doing? So we first of all, in verse 7, we come to this, he says, he brought me to the entrance of the court. So he comes inside the gate, and I saw a hole in the wall. And he said to me, Son of man, dig into the wall. So I dug into the wall. And as I kind of like it, he dug a hole. He's got a peephole here, so to speak. He's looking inside inside into the inner court and chambers. He says, so I dug through the wall and I saw a doorway there, and he said to me, go in and see the wicked and detestable things they're doing. And I went in and I looked, and I saw portrayed all over the walls all kinds of crawling things, detestable animals, all of the idols of the house of Israel. Wow. Right in the inner court. And this is what the text is really telling us was going on in Jerusalem. And in front of them stood 70 elders of the house of Israel. This is not the Sanhedrin. It hadn't happened yet. Most likely these are the kind of the subsequent descendants of the concept that started back with Moses, where there were those that were set aside as leaders and elders in the people to assist him. And this is where we are at this day. And he doesn't say these, he just said there stood 70 elders. Whether there were more or less apart from them, we do not know. But there's 70 elders of the house of Israel. And Jezaniah, the son of Shaphan, was standing among them. Each had a censer in his hand, and a fragrant cloud of incense was rising. These are elders. These are leaders of Israel, 70 of them. And what are they doing? They're burning incense and worshiping graven images, crawling animals, beasts, and so forth that are carved on the wall. No wonder God was provoked. This is in his house, in the sanctuary. This is where God is to be visually portrayed. And we have the pagan activity of these men burning incense to the sculptured animals. They're led by a Jezaniah, son of Shaphan. The problem you have here is it'd be like saying it's led by George, who is the son of Bill. Yeah, okay. We got a lot of Georges and we got a lot of Bills. Which one? So we have to be careful. If this is, some have said, well, perhaps, and that's all we can say. At that point, we have to say we're speculating. Okay? Perhaps it's Shaphan who was the secretary of Josiah. If so, and his son. If so, this would certainly emphasize the quick degradation that has taken place even in that relationship in that government. And that may be true. That may be the connection, but we don't know for certain. All we do know is that he is a leader among the elders. These 70 elders carrying on pagan worship within the inner court of the temple. And the rationalizations that they have are interesting. We go on to read, he says, Son of man, see what the elders of the house of Israel are doing in the darkness, each at the shrine of his own idol. it appears as if they're kind of in, they have their little chambers or cubicles. It's like in the library, when you go in there and study. I hope it's not the same. And they're in there with and it's dark. Amazing. It's always interesting, isn't it? The evil things tend to be done in darkness. And they're burning incense to these, each at his shrine. And they say, the Lord does not see us. The Lord has forsaken the land. God doesn't notice us. Well, now what does that tell us? What's happened in their thinking? They're denying the omniscience of God. They're denying the omnipresence of God. Their view of God is poor at the best. And you see what happens when you don't know God? Or you do not honor Him as God? You can rationalize anything at that point. God's not here. He doesn't care at this point. Yes.
It's interesting with it, at least for me, is being such a covenantally oriented people, knowing their covenants, knowing the promises, knowing the curses, knowing all of those things. It's what you just said against omniscience, but also just again the faithfulness of God, his covenant keeping love, and they're declaring to the people, our God has abandoned us, and it's just a complete refusal to accept that this is what the covenant said. You disobey me, I will do these things to you. And so they basically flipped it over and are blaming God for all of their great struggles. And but you can see that today.
And God lied to us. Yeah. Yes. Oh, yes. Very applicable. You'll have people say the same thing. Well, I don't see anything. And you have that many of the prophets. Well, if God's really around, why didn't he do something? I mean, that type of argument. Yes.
It's more remarkable that if the chronology is correct, in verse 10 it says the glory of the Lord left the temple. So this implies that the glory of the Lord is in the Holy of Holies, just sort of next door to where these men are. I can't conceive how they could, how the Lord would allow that, and or they can ignore that fact while they're doing idolatry.
Yeah, it blows your mind, if I can use that phrase.
They say the Lord does not see us.
That's right.
The Lord is forsaken us. He's right next
door.
Right
there, yeah. Oh yeah, he's not far away at all. Yes, it's a good observation. And so we can certainly understand why very quickly now the glory is going to depart in this context, in preparation for the judgment. And I think God in his working through Ezekiel is specifically, thematically putting these two starkly in contrast, one next to the other in the book. And, but, I mean, this is just starters, by the way, because he's going to go on and notice what he says. Do you see, Son of Man? Do you see this, Son of Man? You'll see things that are even more detestable than this. Whoa, boy, that's exciting. Yes.
Back to the earlier question, is he really seeing something that is literally taking place, or is it just representation of?
I'd say that's a good question, and that's just part of the problem we have when we work with visionary type material, because, and I don't say this facetiously, we've never been in a vision. I can't say, well, look, I had a vision and I was transported to, Moscow, even though I'm here, and this is what I saw going on in the churches in the Kremlin, et cetera, and so forth. And I can tell you, having living there, that that's actually what goes on. See, I have to take it that he's seeking, because the presence of Ezekiel is not in Jerusalem, that he is wanting the people in the exile who are saying this isn't going to happen. Jerusalem's going to be protected. They're going to stay there. Everything's okay. And we're just in a few days, a few months, we're going to be back home. He's wanting them to know why the judgment's coming And he wants them to know, I think, what's going on. So I, again, think that in the vision, he is seeing things as they would be taking place. But I'm not gonna live and die on that one. Okay, point. Yeah.
So you're saying that you see it as real time. It's like today, somebody bringing a video and beaming it back to him and saying, "See what they're doing."
Yes.
Okay.
By analogy, yes. If you
There's no real players
But
on there.
understand, as I say, I'm not going to the stake on that. Okay.
Is there a connection between the elders he sees in the temple and the elders that were sitting before him? Like, was this vision meant to sort of provoke?
No. There are two different elder groups. You see, the elders that are sitting before him in the exile are the leaders of the Jewish people in exile. We would have to assume, were part of the eldership, if I can use that term, within the nation that were deported under the first and second deportations. And that the 70 now we see in Jerusalem are those leaders that either were left behind or who have taken the place of those who were deported. Okay. So it is two different groups at that point.
Do you think that the vision was initiated to affect how Ezekiel was relating to those elders that were around him? Or?
No, I think... Well, I certainly think it has effect upon them, the elders that he's relating to, because, hey, these are, in a sense, your colleagues. You think things are going so wonderfully. Do you really know what the guys are doing back there? What they're doing at home? There it is. Yeah. Yes.
The carving on the wall in verse 10, that then would have happened after they left. So it's in the last
Maybe.
5 years that this would have taken place, right?
Yeah, we don't know that for sure. This could have started and even be something that was already going on, but it could be done later. We don't know in light of the text. Okay, now he says, it's just this, unfortunately, these are starters. Okay, goes on to verse 7. Better get back to the right page here. Verse 7, in verse 14, I'm sorry. In verse 14, he brought me to the entrance of the north gate of the house of the Lord. Okay? So he's moving further in, and I saw women sitting there mourning for Tammuz. Okay? That's all he tells us about this. First of all, we have women in the inner court. That wasn't a normal procedure. Only the priests would go into the inner court. And we have them worshiping, a group of them worshiping Tammuz. Now Tammuz is a deity of the Assyrians, a god of fertility and of rain, very similar to Baal. In Canaanite religion, you have the seasonal cycle that Baal was one who he was the god of the rain, and he brought the rain in the spring, made the land fertile, and the whole concept was the cohabitation of Baal with his mistress Anat, mistress, wife, sister, so forth. It's a fluid relation. This would create the fertility of the land, and so they helped them out by having sacred prostitution in their worship among Canaanites, and would have cohabitation acts of worship to encourage the god and the goddesses to do the same, so the land would be fertile. And then the summer would come, and Mot, the god of death, or Yam, the god of the salt sea, would defeat Baal, and he would die. He would go through the winter and be resurrected again through Anat when he comes back around to the spring season. Well, Tammuz was similar. We don't have the particular sexual interactions that are going on here in the Assyrian worship that we are aware of with Tammuz. But he dies in the early fall. He's revived by Ishtar's wailing. So we do have, again, one of the women that are involved. And then you have the buddings in the springtime and the fertility of the land, very similar. This vision now, our dating was in 592 and the month of September. This will be the time when he's dying and they're mourning the death of Tammuz. Okay? Assyrian religion being practiced right in the temple court at this time. Goes on to say, he says at the end of 15, "Do you see this, son of man? You will see things that are even more detestable than this." 16, "He brought me to the inner court of the house, and there in the entrance of the temple between the portico and the altar, there were about 25 men with their backs to the temple of the Lord and their faces towards the east, and they're bowing down to the sun in the east." So we have sun worship going on by 25 men. Backs to the temple, facing the east, watching the rising of the sun. And of course, once again, the question is, who are the 25? 70? Okay, he told us they were elders. Who are the 25? We don't know, by the way, who the women are either. Who are the 25? Well, yeah, it's interesting. Let me just say something interpretive at this point. It's interesting to note that the emphasis of God in His revelation is not on who's doing it so much as what's being done. It comes across pretty clearly as you go to each one. We know enough to know who's doing it. There's elders, there's men, there's women. We're kind of getting the idea that a lot of people, everybody's kind of involved in this thing. But the main thing is what's happening. We got idolatry, incense burning to images. We have the situation of worshiping a pagan deity from Assyria, Akkadian god Tammuz. We now have people worshiping the sun. And of course we read often in the Old Testament, even starting with the time of Solomon, of how people would worship the sun and the moon and the stars and the constellations. And by the way, people still do that today. And even in this country, well, all the way around the world. So we have 25 people doing this. Some people have said, well, it has to be priests. This is in the inner court. But we've already raised some questions about that. If we got we already have men in there. We have women. The elders, 70 elders here, were in the inner court. So it doesn't look like there was any priority anymore just for priests in this context. That doesn't mean they aren't priests. Okay? It's just to say we don't know that for sure. If we didn't have anybody else in there, then that would be a more logical conclusion. To say, yes, they are probably priests because they're the only ones that were permitted into the inner court. We've already got a crowd. A lot of other people that are involved there as well. Some have argued that, well, perhaps it's the 24 representatives of when David set up the courses of the priests, he set up he had 24 different groups, and then you have the one high priest, that makes 25. And there, of course, the argument's going on number. And that's not necessarily a particularly strong reason to come up with a specific interpretation either. It's a possibility. That's all we could say in that. Some will say, as we come to chapter 11, in verse 1 and following, we have 25 men there. Are they the same? Because you have another Jezaniah mentioned as a leader. Must be the same. Oops, we got different patronymics for their father of Jezaniah. Now, that's not necessarily a problem either, if you've read the Old Testament very much, because people can have two different names. The fact of the matter is, when all is said and done, those are options, but we don't know for sure. Okay? Hope that doesn't bother you. Because, as I said again, the main issue is what's happening. Not so much particularly the specific detail, identity of each group. Sun worship, of course, is explicitly forbidden in Deuteronomy chapter 4. And they are doing this in the context. So we come to 17 and 18. We kind of have a summary. It comes to a summary. He said to me, have you seen this, son of man? Is it a trivial matter for the house of Judah to do the detestable things they're doing here? Must they also fill the land? So now he's saying, now this is bad enough, but listen, not only is this happening here, is it a trivial matter for these detestable idolatry to take place? But must they also fill the land with violence? So it isn't just a religious thing. They're out there creating violence in the land. And you know, I look around in this country, I look around in Russia. Oh, violence is so prevalent everywhere. Well, that's what happens when you go away from God, because sin manifests itself with such ugliness. Sin can be so ugly. We can treat people so bad. It's unbelievable what humans can do to humans. Just unbelievable how bad that can be. So he's saying the violence is filling the land and continually provokes me to anger. Look at them putting the branch to their nose. Well, what is that? There's an article written by Sags about this, a specific article, and I think probably he has demonstrated as well as could be that this is part of the ritual of sun worship. In other words, we're still there with these men, and he's saying, look at them. They're going through the ritual of sun worship. Whatever it is, if it's not part of that ritual, if Sags is wrong at that point, whatever it is, it's offensive to God. That's very clear. It's offensive to God. And as a result, his wrath will be poured out on them. He says, I will deal with them in anger. I will not look upon them with pity or spare them. Although they shout in my ears, I will not listen to them. Kind of interesting. You notice the kind of irony here? They weren't listening to him. And he's not now going to therefore listen to them. So, boy, chapter 8, you go away and you just kind of your head, wow. You know, this is what's going on in Jerusalem. Even after 2 deportations. You think the guys might have gotten the idea that there might be some problems. And gentlemen, this shows you how perverted our minds are. People don't think straight when they're in sin. We don't think straight when we sin. I'll tell you just one brief story about that. As I was in seminary and in our church, when I was in Portland, we had a young couple. And to make a long story short, we had a woman come to our church who had been divorced. This man got involved with this woman. He was a foreigner. He took his wife back halfway to their foreign country and left her in a hotel and returned and married the other woman. He was a seminary student. He was in our church. He was a believer. And we, of course, immediately just confronted him in the church, as well as seminary. And you know what he said to me? Well, this isn't sin. In all sincerity, this is not sin. This woman has promised she needs somebody to help her. You know, we don't think straight when we're in sin. So don't expect sinners to think straight. They don't. Neither do we when we're in sin. We don't think clearly. It's why we've got to fill our mind with the truth and let it permeate our life. And now, in God's great grace, the Spirit of God worked mightily as we dealt with this young man, and he repented. He came back to the Lord. He is living for the Lord today, but you can't solve the problems that were created. in the midst of sin. It's to say, I had to work for a year with that wife, interestingly, overseas. Many places I went, she was there, and I could help her by God's grace. But it took her a year, year and a half to recover from the sin of her former husband.
In verse 18, do you think the cries of the men are cries of petition, repentance, cries for mercy?
That's a good question, and we really don't have specifically. I would think that they're crying out, perhaps as and I'm just telling you ideas. I can't say this is what it is. The elders often come for inquiries to Ezekiel. Whether they're coming for inquiries because it appears that the people in the temple area were perhaps in places of leadership. Certainly the elders were. That's a possibility. Whether they're crying out for help seems unlikely in the context at this point. So I would think it may be that they're, asking questions, or they want to. Again, sinners always know they're in sin, and they've got to have some sense that God's around. So, though they say one thing, they kind of always wiggle and well, maybe I can find out, this. Maybe it's that sort of thing. I really don't know. But God says, in a sense, because of what they're doing, and in the context of what they're doing, let me just take that and mention it. We're going to see very clearly, and this may be one of the situations. It's very clear when he talks about the elders. He says, if you come to me with idols in your heart, I will not hear your inquiry. Boy, I hope we think about that. Because so often, even believers want, they're in sin and they want to come to God and, oh, God, help me, and do this and do that, while they're in deliberate sin. And I think, we're foolish at that point. It's in essence, God is not that God doesn't love us, but God basically says to us, I've already told you what to do. Just read my word. I've already told you what to do. Just do what I've told you. Well, why are you coming to inquire? When you got sin in your heart. Deliberately sin in your heart. But I find many Christians do that. And so I think that's essentially the response that we're having here. That their sin, regardless of what the request, the cry may be, which I don't really know. God's simply saying, because of the sin that pervades your life, I won't hear you. Yes?
Do you see any difference between, you have a group of people that are in Babylon, and then obviously the group remaining in Jerusalem? Do you think that the events of chapter 8 represent sort of a degradation that was worsened because of deportation of certain groups from Jerusalem, like the upper echelon priests and leadership and so on and so forth? Or do you think that this is kind of exactly indicative of the nation as a whole, even including those that were in Babylon as well?
I think the rest of the book would tend to stress the latter, that it's a whole. But we have to keep in mind that Ezekiel is speaking primarily to the exiles. I think some of this probably trickled back home. But he's speaking to the exiles, helping them to understand why the judgment isn't finished, so to speak. Because they had the hopes of returning. We know that historically, and we see that reflected throughout the book. The hope that soon that they would be able to go back because Egypt would rise up and help, and things would be fine. And he's telling them, no, it isn't over. What God has started the discipline, and it will be finished in its fullness. And this is why. There's still the corruption and so forth. These guys didn't get over there because they were lily white, as we would say by our imagery and idioms. They got over there because of sin, and he said it's still happening. In fact, it's perhaps getting worse in that context, which, as I said, just kind of is mind-boggling when you stop from the point of view of the Judean Jews, still in Judea, that have seen two deportations go. But remember I said, what they say about the deportees is, well, you guys must have been the bad guys and you're gone and now the good guys are still here. It's amazing how we can rationalize, isn't it? Yes, here.
When we look into verse 16 in chapter 8, about the 25 of people who were there in the temple, where the priests and the Levites all carried off in the first deportation, or maybe at least the second deportation. So basically there are no priests and the Levites left in the temple.
I don't know that we know that they were all taken in the first deportation. Some were. I'd have to go back and check that. I'm not aware that they all were gone. But that's something to think about, yeah. Okay, so we come to chapter 9. And in chapter 9, we're going to have now the judgment announced of a holy God on this unholy perversion that's described in chapter 8. And this is what is going to happen. And again, he's seeing this, so he's revealing this to him in the vision in somewhat of a prophetic way of what's going to happen, it would seem. And we're going to see in the process the judgment of God and the departure of the glory of God. This is going to begin here. Now he said, I heard him call out in a loud voice, bring the guards of the city here, each with a weapon in his hand. And I saw 6 men coming from the direction of the upper gate which faces north, each with a deadly weapon in his hand. With them was a man clothed in linen, who had a writing kit at his side. And they came and stood beside the bronze altar. Interesting. What's the bronze altar? The place of sacrifice for sin. Interesting they come there because this is one man and 6 others. Okay, we have a man that's dressed in linen, and he has an ink pen. Okay, we have 6 men who are, for lack of any other better word, the executors, all with lethal weapons in their hands. Okay, now what he's going to describe for us here, it says in verse 3, now the glory of the God of Israel went up above the cherubim where it had been and moved to the threshold of the temple before the judgment. Okay, just announced, okay, these 3 guys have come in, they're standing at the bronze altar. The glory of God rises from above the cherubim and goes to here the threshold of the temple, out to the doorway. Now, part of the question here, as some think about this, is this above what are now going to be called the cherubim, the 4 living creatures seen in the vision of chapter 1 that are going to be classified in chapter later here in this vision, identified by Ezekiel as cherubim? Or are these rising up from the cherubim above the Ark of the Covenant? I tend to think it's the Ark of the Covenant because we haven't yet identified the cherubim, the others as being cherubim. Otherwise, you're going to have that whole kind of what is described as a throne chariot sitting in the holy place, going to the threshold. Or, as we're going to see later, and this is why, and this is another option, the 4 living creatures are going to be to the south in the inner courtyard, to the south of the temple threshold. That's going to be, and then we're going to have them come, and the glory is going to fill the temple and the court, and then they're going to take off from there. So, did he arise from there and come over, or did he arise from the Holy of Holies and leave? I don't know that we can say with certainty at that point. I think in the the picture lesson that's taking place here in the contrast of holiness and the profane, it would make sense that he is leaving from the place of his normal visual residence, that is the Holy of Holies, and going to the threshold. But anyhow, the point is, again, and I want to we can discuss these details. The major issue is very clear. The major issue is the glory of God is leaving. Then the judgment will take place in this situation. So, and we're going to see the progressive movement of the glory of God in these next 3 chapters. So the glory of God moves to the threshold of the temple, and the Lord called to the man clothed in the linen who had the writing kit at his side, and said to him, "Go throughout the city of Jerusalem and put a mark on the foreheads of those who grieve and lament over the detestable things that are done in it." Again, this all would tend in the context to imply these are things that are going on, and the judgment's going to come, and he said, and I listened, and he said to the others, "Follow him." That is, 6 people are to follow him through the city and kill without showing pity or compassion. Slaughter old men, young men, maidens, women, children, but do not touch anyone who has the mark. Begin at my sanctuary. Wow. Start right here. This is where it's all coming from. That religious central command, right here in the temple, with the leadership. First, you start there. And I think, again, what comes through in the book of Ezekiel is how leadership has led them astray. The false shepherds, the false leaders have led them astray. Judgment starts there. Now, the man in the linen, and I think the linen, I think the reason for the linen is always throughout the Scripture is a visual picture, a picture lesson of purity, whether it be for the priest or whatever. And I think he goes out and he puts the mark, he puts a towel on each of them who are righteous, those who say this is horrible, this is detestable, this is wrong. There is a repentant heart. They are marked. Everyone else, if you don't have the mark, is killed in the judgment of God. Now, when he says, "You begin at my sanctuary," so they begin in verse 6. So they begin with the elders who were in front of the temple. Those 70 elders started right there. These are the leaders. And they were gone. And Ezekiel is standing there, kind of with his eyes. Wow, what's happening here? Because the text goes on to tell us, and he said to them, "Defile the temple with the court, and fill the court with the slain. Go." So they went out and began killing throughout the city, and while they were killing, I was left alone. He's standing there, and all these dead bodies around him. There, and he says, "I fell face down and crying out, 'Oh, Adonai Yahweh, are you going to destroy the entire remnant of Israel at this outpouring of your wrath on Jerusalem?'" You see the heart of Ezekiel. He's one announcing this, but is everybody going to go? He's concerned at this point. And God very graciously encourages him. He answered me, "The sin of the house of Israel and Judah is exceedingly great. And the land is full of bloodshed, and the city is full of injustice." And in essence, a mild rebuke to Ezekiel. Ezekiel, do you really understand how bad sin is? And do we? Because God is saying there ought to be death for all the sin He says it's exceedingly great. This land is full of bloodshed, and the city is full of injustice. Interesting. Interesting to study the social statements throughout the prophets in the Old Testament. And boy, and look at our situation today. It's kind of convicting. And they say, the Lord has forsaken the land. The Lord does not see me. Did you hear that? He says, so I will not look on them with pity or spare them, but I will bring down on their heads what they have done. And then here's the encouragement. Then the man of linen in the linen came with a writing kit at his side and brought back saying, I have done as you commanded. There was a remnant. He didn't go out and say there wasn't anybody to mark. I just wasted my ink, No, I've done as you commanded. I've marked the righteous. That's the light. That's the glimmer of light for Ezekiel in the midst of such great darkness. Yes.
Can you speak to the question of God's dealing with Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis and his willingness on the interjection of Abraham to spare the city? If you could find just a few righteous people, and yet here he's destroying the city, but yet he's still saving it, but he's still wiping out the entire.
I think the situation again, and we're going to have several things in Ezekiel that will speak to this when we come to chapter 14 later this morning. And we have the situation, actually there's statements about Sodom that we're going to come to. I think what is happening here is that God, I could just simply, I'm not God. That should be obvious. But God knew the situation of Sodom, and he knew the requests that were going to come from Abram. He honored those requests because Abram's heart was to save Lot and his family. Shows his compassion upon him. And so in a sense he's bargaining with God. I don't know if you've ever been in a bargaining situation in the Middle East, but, well, let's see, how about this, price? Well, if I can find 50 righteous, yes. Well, how about 45? Okay. 40? Yeah. Work down to 10. I think Lot literally thought there were 10. God knew there wasn't. And so God is honoring the heart and the request of Abram, which, by the way, is an interesting concept when you think of prayer. Often what we ask for and what we really want to happen, he's saying, he doesn't say anything about Lot. I think it's pretty clear within the context. What we ask for in this context, he's asking for the city to be spared. He's really asking for Lot to be spared. God answered the intent, but not the specific request in that case. And I think that often is true in our prayers because we don't always know how we ought to pray. That's why. Isn't it great? Romans 8:26, the Spirit of God, knowing we don't know how to say it, does it for us. Interesting. But I think he understood that. And I think the same thing here. Here is very clear. There's sin. There's those who are righteous, they will be spared. And that was true even in Sodom. The righteous was spared with Lot. But not the others. So I don't see a conflict in that. I see similarities in that. And I think we have the same thing that we're going to be told later in Ezekiel that and Ezekiel's going to tell us later there's nobody at this time to stand in the gap for the people. Simply isn't anybody. Moses stood in the gap for the people when they crossed the Red Sea. Beautiful example of that's spelled out for us in Psalm 105. But there's nobody here. There's nobody to do that. It just shows you how bad the situation is. You have no one to do that in Judea.
I had a question.
Mhm.
I have a hermeneutical question about the vision in Ezekiel 8 through 11. It's dated at 592. In the vision, there is a team of angels who slaughter the wicked in Jerusalem, starting from the temple on out. The hermeneutical question is, that didn't happen historically in 592 in Jerusalem. This is a vision that Ezekiel sees. It's only until 586 that Babylonians actually do come in and they slaughter people. So my question is, how do we interpret this vision? Because it didn't actually happen at the date. This is is this an angelic interpretation of the onslaught that will happen years later?
Again, I think we have to keep in mind it's a vision. Ezekiel is not there in human presence on the terra firma, on the ground. He is in a vision, seeing what's going on and what will happen. What is God's response? What will be God's response to that? No, it did not happen in 592 because it was in a vision that was being revealed.
There's a corollary to that question, because in my studies of Ezekiel, I've always had to deal with how do we interpret the restored temple in Ezekiel 40 to 47, 48. And I've seen that there is an arc, because in Ezekiel 8 to 11, the glory of the Lord departs from the temple. In Ezekiel 40 to 48, the glory of the Lord returns to the temple.
Yeah, in 42.
But if we interpret the temple vision in Ezekiel 8 to 11 as visionary, then how do we deal hermeneutically with the temple vision at the end of Ezekiel? Do we also interpret that as a vision? Or do we interpret that literally as Feinberg did, as a future millennial temple of gigantic proportions?
But that's still a vision. It's in a vision. It did not happen in 573. See, it is a vision of what will happen at that time. Visions are not actually events going on terra firma. So they are events going on as the recipient sees them going on in the vision. And I think they are at that point things that are realistic when they will occur. He's seeing them at a time either normally prior, in fact always prior, to when they will usually transpire. Okay? And I think that's true here. He's reflecting what is characteristic going on in the temple and the judgment that will come in 587, 586. And I think when you come to the vision of 40 to 48 and 573, it's of that which is, as the text says, in the last days. And of course at that point we have to, and we'll work on that when we get there, about do we have any implications or any ideas about when in the last days. Again, I just simply tell you at that point, once again, that the Hebrews are not as concerned about chronology as we are. That kind of gets us all up in knots sometimes, because we tend to have the linear concept. Their concepts of time is more cyclic. So it's no big deal. It doesn't happen today, it'll happen tomorrow. Okay. If you've ever been in the Middle East, you understand that. If I don't make the sale with you today, it's no big deal. It always has tomorrow. The next day. Anyhow, I think we have to keep put it this way: we have to keep those things in the vision. Okay. We don't immediately at that point in time when the vision is given, plop, put it right down on terra firma. It's happening now at that point. No, these are of things that are coming, sometimes coming quickly. It may come tomorrow, or things that will come further. That's where, again, the time factors are not the primary concern of the prophets.
We do hold to a consistent literal hermeneutic as we study the book of Ezekiel, but there could be figurative languages, even in the literal understanding of the entire passage.
Oh yeah, you want to keep figurative language. If it says it's like something or so forth, if it's a metaphor, we keep it at that. But in the visions, you have them seeing or hearing certain things. Now, in most visions of the prophets, we don't have things to see. We simply say, God, spoke to me in a vision or so forth, and He said. And then we have a message that they're to give. And we kind of walk away from that. We're fine. We don't have problems. We can handle that one. But where we start having the difficulty is when in the vision, the person begins to describe what they see. They're seeing something. Not only they're hearing a voice, but they're seeing something happen. Now that occurs less, but it does occur. And we need to take what they see in the vision at what it says they see, and not say they saw something but they didn't really see that, they saw something else. And that's the problem with some of the hermeneutics that go on when we get to prophetic literature, where people are so quick to want to jump to make what is actually stated something else. Because they don't know, this is just kind of a weirdo. I'm not used to this kind of stuff. And there must be something else. No, in the vision, it's what we're seeing, what they saw. Now, we have to understand that, and I think, like in the vision we have here, it's pretty straightforward. It's not a difficult thing to understand about these different idolatries that are going on, or to understand that there are those who are going to be marked, who will not be involved in the judgment that's coming, and I think there's a respect with that's coming soon. And and we could all go through all the rigmarole. How are they going to be marked in real life and so forth? The point is that there's going to be those who are remnant. If you're righteous, you won't experience it. And how do you tell that in a vision without having some way of distinguishing the one from the other? And so he's distinguishing the one by the fact that they have a mark, and then we have those that aren't. Then everyone else isn't judged. The message is not difficult. We don't have to come up with some imaginations and some symbols and stuff to understand the message that's taking place. And the judgments that are mentioned are going to be those that are recorded for us in the Mosaic Covenant. That's again, they're breaking the Mosaic Covenant, and the disciplines that are occurring are that which are spelled out in the Mosaic Covenant. There's famine, there's disease, there's plagues, there's slaughter by the sword, and you go right down the line, wild beasts and so forth. Those are all mentioned, So, we have our normal grammatical, historical, cultural, contextual hermeneutic that we understand. And when the guy sees a vision, we watch and see what he actually sees. And we don't have to make that something else. Now, if it is in the vision, figurative language, whether it's similes or metaphors or whatever they may be, then we understand them in the vision just as we would understand them in the text, let's say like in John where it says, I am the door. Jesus is not a door. It doesn't take us a lot of smarts, to figure that out. So it's the same. We carry on normal understanding of the text.